SourceSage was started by myself and actually my dad. I mean, the name SourceSage is really coming from source as in source code programming, and Sage is my dad, who has the domain expertise. And the main idea behind that name, before I jump into the background, was really in digitizing the domain knowledge of SMEs, because my dad operated an SME in the chemical trading space into a digital platform. And then of course that concept was more widespread now in terms of digitizing individual SME in retail, in chemical, in wholesale trade space, and across different angles, right? So that's our core offering and original motivation in that sense. My first job was in A-Star in R&D, right? So we were doing data analytics for banks, for clients and all that. Very much research-based work. A lot of skill set doesn't have to be just stuck within the R&D process, right? At the end of the day, it has to be commercialized. So I was always intrigued, and during my 2-year sort of stint at A-Star, before I went out to start my own company, I shifted department towards the commercialization. So I was a researcher. I went on to commercialization, where I was part of the team to give out money to researchers to develop and commercialize. So we came up with business plan for research teams and find first clients for them in that sense, in order to justify government giving grants to the research teams, right? So that approach allows me to understand the commercialization landscape, who are the VCs, who are the potential customers, the technical skills I have. The first product we had in 2014 allowed us to travel to Malaysia, Palm Oil Conference, where we pitched to potential companies to utilize our software to digitize their buying and selling process, right? And in 2015 then we decided, hey, this is something really interesting. We have a lot of uptake from the Palm Oil Conference. Could we then develop this and into a company? So we incorporated then in 16 April. We received our first round of funding fortunately term sheet in June. In November 2015 we secured the first paying customer. That was our sort of tipping point, in the sense that yes, finally someone is paying $300 a year for this software. It was underpriced, but it gives us the satisfaction. So most of our customers back then was foreign MNCs, and of course with the COVID we pivoted a lot to local clients nowadays. Firstly, of course, the travel restrictions. It hit us in a way, it doesn't hit me personally, but it hit some of our colleagues who were deployed actually to foreign countries, the country head or the country manager in, say, Vietnam, where we have a physical office, we have a team. But the first thing we have to think about is how will it affect our employees and colleagues in other countries, especially Singaporeans who were deployed to foreign countries in Vietnam, in India, in Indonesia, and other countries. So we have to call them back and tell them that, hey, let's return back to Singapore until further notice. Yes, we know that your job scope is really to be based in Vietnam, but you don't want to be based there because otherwise you can't come back over the next few months. So we call back our colleagues who were based overseas, and our decision was, we have been paying rent deposit in many of these offices. Do we sort of cut back and say that, okay, we will no longer rent and people you work from home? So we make a really swift and decisive action, which was, okay, we are not going to rent offices anymore. Singaporeans come back to Singapore. For those of you who comes from different parts of, say, India or Vietnam, you go back to your respective homes, and because you don't want to be renting a place in a city that you do not originate from, and you work from home. In Singapore, of course, we then have to work with our head of operations to think about how do we stagger our time, how do we work from home, what's the arrangement in terms of reporting. So we pivoted our business from focusing on foreign MNCs, where it's difficult to travel and engage them to get businesses, to local SMEs, where they became our main target audience for the revenue point of view. So we developed new product lines in order to serve these SMEs locally, which now we call it the online stores. Yeah. COVID was a game changer for us. In 2020, before 2020, we were focusing a lot on larger contracts. The MNCs will get us to build e-commerce platform on the B2B or the B2C side. In 2020, we realized that there was a great trend where many of these larger companies were cutting back their budgets. And in terms of payment terms, a lot of payment terms were also delayed in that fashion. So what we did in 2020 was really in terms of trying to iron out a different path where we can generate new revenue, especially on the SME side, because government were pushing for digitization for many of these traditional SME locally. Yes, so many of the payment terms were delayed. Some companies even split up a 12-month subscription into 6 months period. So there was certain uncertainty. There was certain uncertainties on whether they would be paying after a 6 months period, or whether they would default and say that we will scrap this platform and we will no longer be paying 6 months later. So part of the concern was really on whether they will be paying on an ongoing basis, although they do have a 3 months contract or 3 years contract with us. And the second part, of course, is that with delayed payment, how does it affect the cash flow of the company? But of course, fortunately, SourceSage has successfully raised a round of funding July 2020 due to our good track record, and that has given a lot of sort of bullets or ammunition for us in order to stay on during this pandemic season, which we are grateful. One of the key thing that went through our mind back then was, okay, if our revenue was contributed by these top 5 MNCs, if any one of them were to just pull out, or 2 of them were to pull out, right, it's a game of probability, then 20%, 40% of revenue would immediately drop. So there was a general sort of sentiment from a senior management standpoint, and also the board of directors, that what would happen in such case. So on our feet during July or even April season, we start then to pivot our product line to include could actually SMEs locally become our target audience. So our large e-commerce sort of technology platform was split up into smaller packets of software that could be utilized as an online store for SMEs, and that actually, although that's not a large revenue contributor, that actually helped to sustain certain parts of our bills in that sense, because we have to pay off for server costs and variety of things, including manpower expenses. So for us, it was really about frugality and adaptability. As a startup, one would think that many young companies or young founders would spend a lot in order to drive growth at all costs. But I think the COVID has sort of changed that mindset to become focused on profitability, focus on long-term survival, instead of just increasing valuation at all costs, even though you're losing money. So that change in mindset was important for us, because that's what we believe in from day one. Although many startups would sort of do it differently. And of course, the second case is that because of the change in perception and trend, many investors then found our line of business to be, or our mindset to be, investable in that sense. Yeah. Right. So before COVID in Vietnam, we were selling a sort of different sort of software for larger companies to banks and all that. Back in Singapore, of course, we talk about that e-commerce software for smaller SMEs. So there was that slight change in terms of product lines. It's not so possible for any founders or CEO of any world to project too far ahead, because with the uncertainty of the world, the trade war, the geopolitical issues happening out there, it's a fine balance between thinking like too far ahead versus the short-term opportunities that we have. SourceSage, in terms of our strategic thinking, isn't that short-term and isn't that long-term. We try to strive to seek a common ground, to see our future in the next 2 years or so. In terms of our roadmap, we plan it in 3 different paths, right? So of course, one is in terms of revenue commercial. Our strategy is really towards seeking strategic partners, right? Partners could be the banks, the trade association, government, who could utilize our solution without rebuilding from scratch. Because the key question now is that a lot of companies are affected by COVID. You do not want to build solutions from scratch, and then for your SMEs in different countries, could you utilize something off the shelf that's easily customizable? And that's SourceSage value proposition, to be a configurable platform for each of these larger, we call them the network owners, right, who own the network of SMEs. The second, of course, strategy we thought about in terms of the arena in long-term or strategic thinking is really towards the way we structured our fundraising and external engagement. To us, that's an ongoing effort, because in order for any company to grow, you require resources to be invested in. So we have been talking to many of the key strategic partners locally, and this time, actually, contrary to popular thinking, people would think that investors are actually not investing so much, but it's really who do they invest in, what kind of mindset. So we are talking constantly to the right partners, I believe, who has that long-term thinking with us in our line of business. And of course, the third thing is really in terms of recruitment of talented individuals. Now during this period of time, of course, there will be people being sort of laid off in many of the bigger companies, or even in oil and gas, commodity, because they are affected by COVID, by trade war, by falling demands from a lot of countries. It's also the time where SourceSage can beef up our recruitment for talented individuals in our company. So in terms of that, our thinking is really constant recruitment. So we have school talks, recruitment talks to NUS, SMU, NTU, SIM, in order to get our name up, so people will say, hey, besides joining bigger companies, which now is becoming uncertain as well, could we actually have a new opportunity in startup where you can have a different kind of learning experience? Yeah. Well, I think in any time, I think being empathetic and I think compassion is important in terms of understanding each of the employees' needs. Because at the end of the day, bad time, good time, I mean, there are people have different mindset and thinking about their own problems or their own need. While business leaders might be thinking that this is a way that employees with more skills might run away because they have more opportunity. I think the way we think about it is that it is important in terms of organization in having that manpower to de-risk, and also having opportunities for employees so that they will stay on for learning opportunities. To be honest, I think the students who graduate during this period of time, or even last year, was kind of bad, versus students who graduated 5 years ago, probably would have a different mindset, right, towards the landscape and all that. And what we have seen was that a lot of, and it was in the Straits time as well, I believe that a lot of young people are now seeking for part-time gigs and jobs. Well, I would think that knowledge acquisition is important, right? I mean, whether COVID or not, I mean, it's just part and parcel of a person's attitude towards learning and getting opportunities in different sector. I think another key attribute is really in terms of being flexible in terms of work, because in many companies, I would say, right, because of COVID situation, it has steered the entire direction and focus. Some companies who were used to be very traditional now has shifted 80% of their focus on digital, right, digitization, innovation on platform and all that. Of course, then it requires the employees or the entire team to also shift that focus. But I think that mindset of being flexible in what kind of roles you could take up in a company is also important, because I think what employers moving forward will be looking for is that given such uncertain times, the more adaptable an employee is in terms of job scope, flexibility in shifts and all that will be critical in that decision to hire a person. Well, I guess in any period of time, you'll see entrepreneurs coming in, but of course not everyone would stay on for the long term. The way I think about entrepreneurship after close to 6 years period, I mean, some people say that that's very long, and for most part, people would have already given up or work in a big company or corporation. The advice given to entrepreneur has, for me, it's two different parts, right? I think that constant understanding of your domain area is important, to start in the area that you are passionate and you're knowledgeable or familiar in. I think that's a critical point that people often miss out, right? You may want to try something new, but you may not be familiar, and you lose that competitive advantage in that sense, because people who have that domain knowledge will be miles ahead of you in that sense, right? The second thing I would think about is really that perseverance and determination. Business has ups and downs, right? Even for very large MNCs, they have good times and they have bad times, right? And the case is how not to give up in bad times like COVID and find opportunities. Everyone revenue is affected for sure, right? It's just a matter of how much and how long can you survive in that sense, right? And of course, for those people who really push it on, in the area that they are truly passionate in, and find a niche where they can, scale after COVID, generally survive, right? Look at Amazon, right? They were hit by the dot-com burst, right, in 2000, but they survived while many e-commerce platforms just, collapsed, right? Pets.com and all that. But because of that, mindset, to survive even in bad times, allow them to have enough resource, and they do not have to start from scratch. Imagine if you give it up, during COVID, and then you decide to start over again after COVID, you just have to start from scratch, and that's impossible. No one would do that, right? And for those of people, entrepreneurs who manage to strive through that critical period and find an opportunity or niche during this period of time to secure customers or secure strategic partners, then by the time situation improves, then they scale, right? So the way I think about it is really that longevity of business. If you're in business, you want to be in business for long term, definitely to survive and scale. And I think that the old and young mixture within the company has been our main focus. Our head of operations is 59, turning 60. To many companies, that is like you already retired, right? 55, they probably find somebody younger. In our context, I'm a personal believer of having somebody older, somebody younger, to balance the mixture. So the younger could come up with innovation and work faster, but the older could really help manage and set things right, from cultural standpoint and all that. So that has been our focus. For smaller SMEs, the question is how do we then drive transaction even though they have digitized? Because many of them are probably very new to this e-commerce space, especially the traditional mom and pop shops just across the road or downstairs. So the next question we had was, how do we innovate to build that connector or integration to those larger buyers, right? Because then it's difficult for them to really buy from overseas. If they were to buy, could they have opportunities to buy from local SMEs? And that connecting point or connector, in technical term, that we built to procurement software was that slight innovation or change. But the way we think it, you may think that that's incremental, but that has significant value to SMEs who are looking for additional sales channel digitally. Besides, of course, selling on the likes of Lazada, Shopify, or Shopee or Q10, but no one has really thought about how do we integrate to procurement software, and that was exactly one of the webinar we have done with Lazada just a couple of days ago. And many of the sellers on third-party marketplaces was really receptive towards the idea of how do we actually get connected to corporate buyers. And I think that represents a huge opportunity for us from a product and revenue standpoint, and also for the SMEs in the long term. We are still small. We have the privilege to do like a Friday evening town hall where everyone shares their innovation, the features they build, the things they have done, and something that I'm proud of from an achievement standpoint, right? So that is like, for me, a first tier of sharing, right? Very basic, understanding what your colleague is doing, understanding whether there are opportunities to contribute to what your colleague is doing and share advice and knowledge. So that's the first tier. Now the second tier, of course, is not the Friday weekly town hall, but more towards knowledge sharing in your particular team or department, if you were to say that. Is that if I'm an engineer and I just want to understand how do you do like search engine optimization, right? So we have instilled people who are good in that area, where we find out through conversation that, hey, can you do this sharing topic to the rest of the colleagues, because they might be facing the same issue. They might be struggling to see, hey, how do I actually do Google Analytics for our clients? How do I advise them? In terms of sales team, because they may not be that tech savvy, right? But having that knowledge helps to imbue that knowledge into them so that they're able to probably sell better, right? And it's good for them on a long-term career goal interest. So we have that 30 and usually a 60-minute session where they will prepare slides or demo from their computer to allow the other colleagues within the team to understand what this domain is about. How can you actually build in your first sort of task or tutorial in that, and of course how that can be applied. And of course we have Q&A, so it's a lively interaction. For those of them who couldn't attend the call due to commitments or leave, we actually record knowledge sharing session, so that can be sort of playback. It's not like a Facebook live stream, but at least it's recorded on Google Drive internally. They can get access and they can relearn again.